Welcome to Florence, Alabama, a city where history whispers through every brick and stone. Today we step inside one of its oldest landmarks, the historic Pope's Tavern. A once believed stagecoach stop, Civil War hospital, and gathering place for travelers, this site holds stories that blur the line between truth and tall tale. Together, we'll explore artifacts that survive centuries and uncovering the layers of history woven into these walls. Join me as we journey through Pope's Tavern, where the past isn't just remembered, it's alive.
So, first of all, the location of what is now called Pope's Tavern, the street out beside us here, Hermitage Drive, was part of Andrew Jackson's military road, completed in the mid-1820s, which connected Nashville to New Orleans, Louisiana. So it's a very important thoroughfare in the early statehood period.
Sure.
And especially connecting us to Nashville, which is arguably the regional center of commerce and culture and migration in the early period that we're talking about, whenever this site would have been first settled by European Americans.
Okay.
This site, the earliest attestation that we have of a structure on this lot comes from 1845.
1845, okay.
Now, a historic structures report done in the 1980s concluded that the two rooms on the west side of the house are probably the oldest and probably date from the mid-1830s, as you pointed out.
Right.
Now, this is a far cry from earlier claims that were made about this house within recent memory.
Okay.
So
Fill us in.
the house was acquired by the city of Florence in 1965 and renovated and opened as a museum in 1968. And leading up to that, a number of claims were made about this house that we as historians cannot verify. So for example, it was claimed that it was the oldest house in Florence, that it was built in 1811, that Andrew Jackson stayed here, that Abraham Lincoln stayed here, that it was a hospital during the Civil War. Now, these are all claims that have been made in print about this house that we cannot independently verify.
Okay.
And it's, like it or not, the baggage that we deal with whenever it comes to interpreting this site.
But you know, when you have that one space in most historic towns, like you just have all of those different interpretations of it. And I can only imagine that even not only here, but in other places, like people want that one site to be the darling of the town. You know what I'm saying?
And I think that especially here locally, there are a number of legends and apocryphal stories that are kind of baked into our collective consciousness of the area. And the more that you examine them, the more you find that they don't hold water.
But today you're going to tell us the real deal.
I'm going to tell you, to the best of my knowledge, what we can actually prove about the site, which is actually a pale fraction of what people have claimed about the site.
All right, well, let's get to it.
You know, as you mentioned, we first met when I was at the public library here in Florence in the local history and genealogy department.
Yep.
I really cut my teeth on local history from a genealogist's perspective. It's the reason why I do what I do. The reason why I became a historian of the Civil War is because of my ancestors in Lauderdale County and trying to contextualize their experiences during the Civil War.
Okay.
But from a genealogist's perspective is how I interpret the history of this site. And that's important, I think, because as genealogists, we do not make any claims that we don't have documents to support.
For sure.
And indeed, we let documents guide us in the direction that we will go. And the conclusions that we make are based on documents. So I really don't care what people claimed about this house in the 1950s and 60s. To an extent, it's interesting to see how people imagine this place, but I'm much more interested in what we actually know based on contemporary 19th century evidence, which is my guiding light and guiding principle.
For sure.
So, welcome in. Again, as I pointed out, a historic structures report done in the early 1980s from Middle Tennessee State University concluded that these two rooms on the west side of the house, this one that we currently call the parlor room and this one that we call the dining room, are probably the oldest, and they probably date to the mid-1830s. Now, this is a far cry from those earlier claims of a construction date sometime around 1811. Now, 1811 is a really improbably early date, because until 1816, the land where we now stand, north of the Tennessee River in what is now Florence, was claimed as Chickasaw native homeland.
I was just about to ask, what was the landscape prior to?
Yes.
Okay.
So 1816, the Chickasaw signed a treaty with the United States, but before that, The United States is actively removing white settlers from north of the Tennessee River. With the military, they're considered squatters because they do not have the legal right to settle on what was then Chickasaw native homeland. The Cherokee had a competing claim north of the Tennessee River in what was called Double Heads Reserve. They sign away their claims to that land in 1817. And it is a very quick turnaround in March of 1818 that a number of prominent gentlemen from the eastern United States, among them James Jackson, but also John Coffey, Dabney Morris, John McKinley, who will become a Supreme Court justice, and others, formed the Cypress Land Company in March 1818. And they gobble up massive amounts of land, thousands of acres from the federal government from this newly acquired Native American cession. And they subdivide up that acreage in a number of lots that would become the city of Florence. They subdivide it up, intending to make a tidy profit for themselves. And they set aside the best tracts of land for themselves. And if you go out to the site of the Forks of Cypress Plantation House today,
which is on fire right there.
Yes, it burned June 6th, 1966, which is an easy day to remember because it was 6/6/66.
A lot of sixes.
Yes, very easy to remember. But if you go to the site today, you will see the local prominence of the location, where the Big Cypress and Little Cypress fork, there's a prominence, a hill there, and really flat, arable land. So it's very productive land from the perspective of someone who intends on establishing a plantation for the production of cotton. And Western Lauderdale County is really unique in terms of its geography. If you look at geological maps, at topographic maps, Western Lauderdale County is much more similar to the delta of Mississippi and the Black Belt region of South Alabama than it is with Eastern Lauderdale County, which has much more in common with the Cumberland Plateau region and the Appalachian Mountains. So that dichotomy, that disparate nature of the terrain in Lauderdale County is part of the reason why we saw in the antebellum period the largest plantations and the most enslaved people in Lauderdale County in the Big Bend of the River in the west part of the county, is because that's where the terrain actually was favorable for large-scale plantation agriculture.
It made sense. And you know, for individuals who've been following this channel, so my connection here at the Forks of Cypress, in Florence, is the Forks of Cypress. James Jackson, as Jordan just mentioned, as well as his wife, Sarah Moore Jackson, held my ancestors in bondage here in Lauderdale County. And so some of the items that are also here in this museum, which we'll talk about, were items that were in the Forks of Cypress. And they've just done such an amazing job of identifying descendants of the enslaved humans here, as well as enslaved humans who were here, such as Parson Dick. And when I mean here, I don't mean at Pope's Tavern, I mean in Lauderdale County, specifically at the Forks of Cypress. And these are some images of grandchildren of our enslaved grandfather that my cousin Karen and I donated to the site. And they have just been amazing in making sure that people have a comprehensive understanding of the history here. So it's, you know, we're just always forever indebted with the relationship that we have with you all. But I just wanted to put that information out there.
Sure.
As it relates to my fourth great grandfather, Ferdinand Jackson, actually seeing most likely some of the stuff that I'm seeing today, for sure.
Yes, personally, I think it's irresponsible to talk about the opulence, the luxury, and the wealth that Jackson and others were able to amass and acquire. It's irresponsible to talk about that without talking about the fact that it is built upon, predicated upon, the exploitation and enslavement of human beings. Sure. And whenever we see the fine furnishings that have been with this museum since day one, since it opened in 1968, things like this piano, which were manufactured in Philadelphia in 1832, I tell visitors who come to the museum, because your first reaction, of course, is to ooh and ah, and say, wow, what a beautiful item, wow, what a luxurious piece, it's amazing that it's here. But to think about the logistics of what would have been required to not only purchase a piano in the 1830s, but have it brought to Florence, Alabama from Philadelphia. It is hard enough to move a piano across town with a U-Haul. To think about the capital that you would have been able to, and needed to command to acquire this luxury item. It is an ostentatious display of the wealth that James Jackson was able to accumulate, and wealth which is, again, built upon, predicated upon, bankrolled upon blood, sweat, tears, toil of enslaved human beings. And not only the piano itself, but James Jackson is famed as an importer and breeder of fine English thoroughbred racehorses. And what I find in the past, especially in the way that people would talk about Jackson and the wealth that he had, it's almost in this kind of unquestioning fangirl kind of spirit, right? Like, oh, how cool. He imported fine English thoroughbred racehorses. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't it wonderful? Without ever stopping to say, what made that possible? How did this man acquire this wealth? What was his wealth built upon? And that's why I say I think it's irresponsible to talk about it in that kind of way, because what you risk is romanticizing this entire social system, the slaveocracy of the antebellum South. You risk romanticizing it in a way that overlooks, or worse, pardons the fundamental original sin built into it. And we risk this sort of gone with the wind feel of what the antebellum South was like. And I feel like that's what we have made such a conscious effort to avoid whenever we talk about the items in our collection here. And to present, and why we are eternally grateful for you and your family for sharing these images and these stories with us so that we can put a human face behind this nebulous, abstract slaveocracy and say, these are people, these are things that are happening to men, women, and children against their will, this exploitation by Jackson and others.
Real quick before we go in there, so this was another item that was held at the Forks of Cyprus, right? This was the secretary, or?
That is what has been claimed about this item. Now, I don't actually know that for sure. I can tell you the items in this room that definitely do come from the Forks of Cyprus because they were deeded to the museum from Jackson family descendants.
All right, let's do that rundown real quick.
So the coffee urn,
definitely
from the Forks of Cyprus.
Here we go.
The Loud Brothers piano, 1832 Philadelphia, definitely from the Forks of Cyprus.
And it has it, you all have laminated that with this right here.
Definitely before my time. We would never do that these days with a 200-year-old item. And then these two chairs, the so-called Hitchcock chairs with the elaborate painting on the back, they definitely are from the Forks of Cyprus.
Hitchcock chairs.
I believe so. Now, that is what was deeded with the deed of gift sometime in the late 1940s. That's whenever the museum that was located at the University of North Alabama is our predecessor. So a lot of the furnishings that we have came from there. And I know that those items were from the Forks of Cyprus.
And so this would be another original room per the MTSU survey.
Exactly.
Right. And then this is Sarah Moore Jackson, you all.
That's right.
Right here, which is James Jackson's wife.
Sometime later in life. Maybe in the late 1860s or early 1870s, just judging upon her age and sort of the clothing that she's wearing. But that's part of the trouble, I think, of interpreting a lot of these things is that people love to say things about them and what we actually know pales in comparison. There is an infographic on this table that claims that this dining table was made from a piano being delivered to the Forks of Cyprus. It says that the piano fell off of the wagon and was busted up beyond repair, and so they salvaged the wood and made this dining table. I think that that is malarkey. I do not believe that. Mostly because there's not that much usable wood in a piano. And secondly, because I have an invoice from a purchase order at a local antique store in 1968, and a dining table is among the things that they acquired.
Oh my God.
Now, back to the question of the tavern, we have no evidence that this site ever functioned as a tavern. It was only ever private residence. One of the greatest pieces of historical documentation we have for this site comes from a classified advertisement in 1860. So the year before the war breaks out, this lot is sold by the man who owned it at the time. His name was Charles Gookin. He was a merchant, and he is selling the lot. and he describes in the advertisement everything that's on the lot. So he says in the advertisement that there is a dwelling house and a boarding house separated by a small yard. Now, it's just my hypothesis, but I think we are now standing in the small yard. Yes. So not only was there the dwelling house and boarding house, but there are a number of outbuildings, stable, outhouse, smokehouse, an expansive orchard. So there's a lot on this site, and it's multiple buildings. So then what happens, I believe, after the Civil War, when Lambeth acquires the house in 1874, under his direction, they start to enclose this multiple structures into one. Now, also we know that in the 1890s, the house caught fire multiple times, and was renovated extensively. And that we know that because it was reported in the newspaper.
So this would be a newer wing of the home.
Most likely. Now, and in the 1920s and 30s and on up to the 40s, this room was actually subdivided into a number of small apartments.
Really?
Yes, it's hard to imagine, but we know that that's true. There was a separate entrance.
The 1890s?
This would have been in about the 1920s to the 1940s and 50s even.
Wow.
So that's actually what the city did whenever it acquired the house in the 1960s, is they took down the partition walls and extensively renovated the house. They tore off the back porches, they added windows, they took out doors, major structural alterations. So I say all that to say it's important to know that even whenever we think about this house at the time of the Civil War, what it looked like then is probably not what it looks like now. Even from the outside, it probably took its current shape around 1904, right around the turn of the 20th century. But during the Civil War, and whenever we think about claims made about this house, that it was a hospital for Union and Confederate soldiers, well, it probably wasn't even it was multiple buildings that were here on the site in the 1860s, and we know that because it was sold in 1860. So that's part of the trouble of the site, is that the way it looks today is an anachronism compared to how it would have been in the mid-19th century.
For sure.
Thank you for joining me on this journey through historic Pope's Tavern here in Florence, Alabama. But we're not finished yet. In part 2 of our visit, Jordan will take us deeper into the history of the Civil War right here in Florence, a story you don't want to miss. So make sure you're subscribed and don't forget to set the notification bell so you'll know the moment when it's released. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next episode.